the last night in the mountain cabin. The snow started just after 4. You noticed it the way you notice most things here, slowly, without urgency, the way the mountain teaches you to look. One moment, the window showed only grey sky and dark pine, and then, between one breath and the next, there was snow. Small flakes at first, barely there, drifting sideways in the still air. Then more. Then the kind of steady, unhurried snowfall that suggests it has been planning this for some time and sees no reason to rush. You had been sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in your lap. You weren't sure you had been reading it. The words had been passing through your eyes the way light passes through curtains, present, filtered, not quite arriving. It was your last night. The thought sat quietly somewhere at the back of your mind. Not heavy exactly, but noticeable, like a stone in your pocket that you keep forgetting about until your hand brushes it again. You had been here for 7 days. 7 mornings of waking to silence so complete it felt like something physical. 7 evenings of firelight and pine resin and meals eaten without having to explain anything to anyone. Tomorrow, you would drive back down the mountain. But tonight was still this. The cabin had been here long before you arrived, and it would be here long after you left. You had thought about that on the first day when you were still carrying the particular kind of restlessness that follows you out of ordinary life like a shadow. The cabin did not seem to notice that restlessness. It simply continued being itself. The low ceilings, the thick stone walls, the wooden beams overhead that had darkened with age into something close to black, the small kitchen with its 2 mugs and its single pot, the bookshelf along the east wall, full of paperbacks left by other visitors over what must have been many years, some of the spines bleached almost white, the titles barely legible. You had picked a few of them up over the week, reading a chapter here, a page there, not needing to finish anything. That had felt like a small freedom. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The pines at the edge of the clearing were already holding it on their branches, dark arms weighted with white. The clearing itself was filling in slowly, the shapes of the world becoming softer. Whatever had been edges were becoming suggestions. Whatever had been definite was becoming perhaps. You set your book down on the arm of the chair and simply watched. The fire needed attending. You could tell without looking. There was a subtle shift in the quality of warmth in the room, a slight drawing inward of the heat, the way a fire speaks to you when it wants something. You got up from the chair slowly, in no hurry, and crossed the rug to the fireplace. The rug was old, thick woven in dark reds and browns, the kind of rug that has absorbed so many winters it has become a winter itself. Your socks were thick, and the floor beneath the rug was stone, and still you felt nothing cold, only the particular softness of wool under your feet. You added 2 logs from the stack beside the hearth. They were dry, and the fire accepted them without complaint, taking a moment to consider, then brightening. Orange light moved across the ceiling. The smell shifted slightly. Something resiny, something clean. The smell of a living tree still present somehow inside the wood even now. You stayed crouched by the fire for a moment, watching it settle into its new arrangement. There was something almost hypnotic about the way flames moved, always changing, never uncertain, never stopping to wonder what they were doing. You thought that sometimes you envied fire its simplicity. Then you thought that was the kind of thought that only comes when you have finally, after several days, started to slow down. You stood up. The room was warm. The snow was falling. Your last night had barely begun. You thought you might make tea. The kitchen was small enough that 3 steps took you from one end to the other. The kettle was old, a metal one that you set directly on the gas ring, and it ticked and sighed as it began to warm. You leaned against the counter and looked through the small kitchen window. This one faced north toward the steeper part of the mountain, and at this hour there was nothing to see but the snow and the dark shapes of the trees, and, somewhere above, the suggestion of a ridge you had walked on 3 days ago, though now it was invisible behind cloud and falling white. You had walked a great deal this week, up through the forest in the mornings when the light came sideways through the trees and the ground was soft with old needles, along the rocky paths above the tree line in the afternoons, when the sky opened up and you could see for miles, other mountains, valleys filled with low cloud, a river somewhere far below catching the light in brief silver flashes, back down in the early evenings when your legs were pleasantly tired and the cabin was already visible through the trees, already warm-looking, already home in the way that temporary places sometimes become home more completely than permanent ones. The kettle began to murmur, not boiling yet, just thinking about it. You found the tea in the cupboard, a box that had been here when you arrived, dark leaf, no brand you recognised, probably left by someone else long ago. You had been using it all week. There were 4 bags left. You took one. The murmur of the kettle became a soft roar, then the beginning of a whistle, and you lifted it from the ring before it could become fully insistent. You poured the water, watched the colour bloom outward from the bag like something opening. Set the mug on the counter and let it sit. There was no hurry. That had perhaps been the most difficult thing to learn, arriving here. That there was no hurry. Your body had not believed it at first. Your body had kept presenting you with urgencies, things to check, things to think about, plans to be made, problems to be turned over and examined and solved, or at least worried about productively. It had taken 3 days for your body to understand that there was nothing here that required that kind of attention, that the only thing required was to be here, to sit in the chair, to watch the snow, to let the tea cool slightly before drinking it. You wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move into your palms, your fingers. Outside, the snow fell without comment. You brought the tea back to the chair by the window and sat down again, folding your legs underneath you. The book was still on the arm of the chair. You looked at it for a moment, then didn't pick it up. You watched the snow instead. There is a particular kind of watching that is not quite looking. It does not search for anything. It does not expect anything to happen. It is simply the quiet occupation of your eyes, the way they rest on something moving and follow it without effort, without intent. Snow is very good for this kind of watching. Each flake takes its time. Each one arrives at its own pace and in its own direction, and none of them are wrong. You sipped your tea. The fire spoke occasionally, a soft crack, a shift, a small collapse of one log against another. These sounds were so familiar by now, after 7 evenings, that they had become part of the texture of the room rather than interruptions to it. Like the occasional settling of the roof under the weight of new snow. Like the distant, barely there sigh of wind against the stone walls. The cabin was old enough to have its own sounds, its own small vocabulary. You had learned to listen to it without needing to understand it. The way you might listen to a language you don't speak, attending to the rhythm and the feeling of it rather than the meaning. There was something restful in that, in sounds that asked nothing of you. You held the mug with both hands and let your eyes rest on the falling snow and let your thoughts do whatever they wished, which it turned out at this hour, in this place, was not very much at all. At some point, the light outside changed. Not dramatically. Not the way light changes in a city, where it snaps from grey to dark and back again at the direction of electricity. Here it changed the way everything else changed, gradually, almost imperceptibly, so that by the time you noticed it was different, you could not have said exactly when the change had happened. The snow was still falling, but the sky had shifted from the pale grey of afternoon to something deeper, something that was not quite blue and not quite purple, but contained both of them at a distance. The pines at the edge of the clearing had lost their detail and become shapes, silhouettes, dark and quiet. The clearing itself glowed faintly, all that accumulated white holding whatever light remained. It was, you thought, one of the most beautiful things you had seen all week. And you had seen beautiful things all week. You sat with that for a while. The thought that there was beauty so ordinary and available that it simply required stillness and time, and that most of the time you did not have, or did not take, either of those things, and that somehow that felt less like a tragedy tonight and more like a useful piece of information, something to carry back down the mountain, a kind of reminder. Your tea was almost finished. The mug was warm against your hands. You didn't want to leave. That thought arrived quietly, the way it had been arriving in small waves all day. You didn't want to leave. But wanting to leave would have meant something else had to begin. And tonight, something else beginning felt very far away and not quite real. And here, this chair, this fire, this window full of falling snow, this was very real. So you stayed in it. Later, you decided to eat something. Not because you were very hungry. The week had softened your appetite, replaced the urgency of meals with a gentler kind of nourishment. But because eating was a quiet activity, and you were in the mood for quiet activities, there were provisions left, not many. Some bread that was still good, dense and dark, the kind that keeps well in cold air. A piece of hard cheese. Some of the dried fruit you had brought but barely touched. You arranged these things on the small board and carried it back to the chair, setting it on the low table beside you. You ate slowly, in small pieces, without reading or thinking about anything in particular. The bread was dense and satisfying. The cheese was sharp. The dried apricots were sweet in the way that dried fruit is sweet, concentrated, a little chewy, more intense than a fresh thing, as if they had spent their drying time slowly becoming more fully themselves. Outside, the snow had slowed. It was still falling, but gently now, almost thoughtfully, as if the sky too had begun to settle in for the evening. The clearing was very still. The pines held their white and did not move. You finished eating and set the board aside. The fire was comfortable. You added one more log, smaller this time, because you were not trying to sustain it through a long night, only through an evening. The kind of fire you make when you know there is an end in sight and you want the end to arrive gently. The log caught and the fire brightened for a moment, then softened back to its working level. Amber and red, the slow pulse of it. You pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and draped it over your lap. The room was very warm. The snow outside was very still. The fire made its small sounds. You thought about the week, not in an organising way, not in the way you sometimes review things, making sense of them, filing them. More the way you look through a box of old photographs, picking one up, looking at it, setting it down, not needing them to be in order. The morning you had climbed above the tree line and stood in thin, cold air with the whole valley beneath you, and felt, briefly but completely, that nothing was wrong with anything. The afternoon you had sat on a boulder by the stream and watched the water moving over the stones for so long that when you finally stood up, you weren't sure how long you had been there. The evening 3 days ago, when the clouds had cleared at dusk and the sky above the ridge had turned a colour you didn't have a name for, something between rose and copper, something that lasted perhaps 4 minutes before the light was gone and the stars began. You had not photographed any of it. That had been intentional at the start. Then it had stopped being intentional and simply become the way things were here. You had left your phone in the drawer by the bed after the first day, taking it out only briefly in the evenings to confirm that nothing required your immediate attention, and then putting it away again. The confirmation had been consistent. Nothing required your immediate attention. Possibly, you thought, nothing ever had. You were not sure that was true, but it was interesting to consider. The fire settled. The snow outside had stopped now, or nearly stopped. There were still occasional flakes, wandering down through the dark air as if they had been delayed somewhere and were only now catching up with the rest. The clearing was white and smooth and very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. Not emptiness, but presence. The presence of everything that is not making a sound. The trees, the snow, the stone walls, the sleeping mountain. You were very comfortable. The blanket was heavy and warm. The chair held you the way good chairs do. Not perfectly, not expensively, but honestly. It had held many people over the years. You could feel that somehow in the way it received you. The way very old things sometimes feel more solid than new ones, more settled in what they are. You let your eyes close for a moment. Not sleeping, just resting your eyes. The fire murmured. The room was amber behind your eyelids. You thought about the drive down tomorrow. The road would be icy in places. You would need to be careful through the upper bends. Then the valley. Then the wider road. Then, at some point, the motorway, and the noise of other cars, and the particular quality of light that belongs to cities and retail parks and service stations. Flat, even, purposeful. A different world. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was still the fire, still the snow, still the absolute, encompassing quiet of the mountain at 8 o'clock in winter. You let the thought of tomorrow go the way you might release something from your hand and watch it drift away. It did not leave violently. It simply became less insistent, less present, further away. Your breathing had slowed, you noticed, the kind of slowing that happens without effort, without intention, your body simply deciding on its own that it could take its time now, that nothing required it to be quick. Your hands rested in your lap beneath the blanket, loosely curled. Your shoulders had dropped without you asking them to. The weight of your head felt pleasant, the way heaviness feels pleasant when you finally allow yourself to put something down. There was a particular kind of tiredness that came after a week of walking in cold air and sleeping deeply and eating simple food. Not an unpleasant tiredness, not the exhaustion of effort and strain, but something quieter. A tiredness that felt almost like satisfaction, like the tiredness of a day that has been fully used. You thought about the bed waiting in the other room, the heavy duvet, the cold pillow that would warm quickly, the sound of nothing outside the window, or almost nothing, just wind occasionally, just the settlement of the cabin under snow. But not yet. For now, the chair, the fire, the dark window showing white. It occurred to you, somewhere in the warmth and the quiet, that you had not thought about very much this week. Not in the way you usually thought, urgently, circularly, looping back to the same concerns, the same unresolved things, the same questions with their same provisional answers. You had thought about other things instead. The angle of light through pine, the temperature of water in a high stream, the way your breath made shapes in cold air and then vanished. Small things, physical things, things that existed entirely in the present tense. And perhaps that was what a week like this was actually for. Not solving the things you brought with you, not coming back with answers, just spending 7 days in a different relationship with your own mind. A quieter relationship, a less argumentative one. The problems would still be there tomorrow, they always were. But perhaps, maybe, you would approach them differently. Perhaps you would carry a little of this mountain quiet with you, tucked somewhere inside, for a while at least. A few days. Long enough to remember that it existed, that it was possible, that you could find your way back to it when you needed to. You hoped that was true. You thought it might be. The fire had settled into its low, comfortable work. There was not much of it left. The log you had added earlier had given most of itself already, and what remained was a deep red architecture of coals, glowing steadily, reliably, without hurry. A fire at the end of itself is perhaps the most beautiful kind. All drama gone, only warmth remaining. You watched it through half-closed eyes. The light it cast on the ceiling was very gentle now, more amber than orange, more suggestion than statement. The beams overhead were almost lost in shadow. The room had gathered itself inward, the way rooms do in the late evening, becoming smaller and warmer and more complete. Outside the window, the clearing was a perfect white. The trees stood in their darkness. The sky above was, you could not quite see it from where you sat, but you knew it, full of stars by now. Clear and cold and very far away. The particular stars of high places, more numerous and closer seeming than the stars you knew at home. As if up here the sky had less to compete with and could simply be itself. You would not go out to look at them tonight. Tonight was for staying in. At some point you became aware that you were very nearly asleep. Not with alarm, with something more like recognition. The way you recognize a place you have visited before. Oh yes, here, this. Your thoughts had become less coherent. Not in an anxious way, not the kind of incoherence that comes from tiredness and worry and too much unfinished business in your head, but the gentle drifting kind. The kind where one image dissolves into another without logic and without distress. The pines in the snow became the pines in the morning light, became the path through the trees, became the sound of water, became the silence of the bedroom at the back of the cabin. The fire was very low now. The room had not cooled. The stone walls held heat long after the fire itself had let go. But it was a different kind of warmth now, quieter, more even. The warmth of things that have absorbed heat and are slowly returning it. The warmth of the earth itself, perhaps, through the stone floor. the warmth of all the winters this cabin had held, given back. You were warm all the way through. Your breathing was very slow. Your thoughts were very light. Perhaps you dreamed for a moment. Perhaps you only rested so deeply that it became something close to a dream. There was a forest. Morning. Light the colour of honey coming through the trees at an angle. The sound of a bird somewhere, not close, not urgent, just present. A path leading somewhere. Your feet on old pine needles, soft and giving, each step soundless. No destination, only the walking, only the light moving with you through the trees. And then the fire made a small sound, a last settling, a coal shifting, and you were back in the chair, in the room, in the warmth. Not startled, just returned. The fire was almost out now. A glow more than a flame. Patient. Finishing itself quietly. You thought that it was probably time for bed. But you did not move immediately. You sat for one more moment in the almost dark, in the warmth, with the white of the clearing still faintly visible through the window. The snow had a luminosity of its own, even at this hour, even without the moon, as if it were returning light that had been stored there since some earlier part of the day, giving it back now to the dark. One more moment. One more slow breath. You set the blanket aside. You placed your feet on the floor. You stood slowly in the amber glow of the last of the fire. The room around you was full of the week. The 2 mugs on the kitchen counter, the book on the arm of the chair, the crumbs from the bread on the board, the boots by the door, still carrying the dried mud of yesterday's path, the coat hanging on the peg, slightly crooked, all of it familiar. All of it for one more night, yours. You crossed the room to the window and stood for a moment looking out at the clearing. The snow was very white and very still. The pines stood in their dark line at the edge of it. Nothing moved. Nothing needed to move. It was so quiet you could almost hear the snow being snow. You rested your forehead against the cold glass for just a moment. The cold was sharp and clear against your skin, and then even that softened, as if the glass were warming to you, as if everything in this place had decided to be gentle tonight. You didn't want to leave, but wanting to leave would have meant something else had to begin, and something else beginning could wait. Tonight was still here, still warm, still this particular silence on this particular mountain, with the clearing full of snow and 7 days of something important quietly settled into your bones. Tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight there was only the walk to the bedroom, the pull of the heavy duvet, the cold pillow, the dark. You turned away from the window. You moved through the room one last time, touching nothing, needing nothing, only passing through it in the way you pass through a place you love and know you will remember. The bedroom door was open. The room was dark and cold and waiting, the way bedrooms are cold when the rest of the house has been warm. But it would warm. It always did. You knew that. You sat on the edge of the bed. You took off your socks. You lay down. The pillow was cool against your face. The duvet settled over you, heavy and complete. The mattress received you without ceremony, without fuss, simply accepting your weight the way the mountain had accepted the snow, as a matter of course. As the obvious thing. Of course you are here. Where else would you be? You stared at the ceiling for a moment. It was very dark. You could just make out the line where the walls met, the faint geometry of the room around you. Outside, the night was deep, and the clearing was white, and the pines were standing in their patient way, and the stars, if you had been there to see them, were extraordinary. But you were here, in the dark, in the warmth coming slowly through the duvet, in the sound of nothing, which was the sound of everything resting. Your eyes closed, not because you asked them to, only because it was time. The mountain held you without effort. The cabin held the mountain. The night held all of it, gently, the way night does, not taking anything away, only covering it, keeping it safe until morning. Your breathing was very slow now. Your hands were still. You were somewhere between this room and somewhere else. Not quite the forest from the almost dream, not quite the cabin. Somewhere between the two, somewhere warm and unhurried, and full of the smell of pine and old wood and cold air and tea and the last of the fire. Somewhere good, somewhere yours. And there was nowhere else to be, nothing to do and nowhere to go, and nothing waiting that couldn't wait, and the snow was still, and the mountain was still, and you were warm, and the night was long and gentle. And you were already, very slowly, somewhere else. Somewhere quiet, somewhere soft. Somewhere the snow falls without hurrying, and the fire settles without going out. And the morning, whenever it comes, will come gently. For now there is only this, the warm dark, the slow breath, the mountain keeping watch, and you resting inside it, resting, still, safe.